First of all, thank you very much to South Gallery and especially Mary Joanna for inviting us and showing this series. And what we want to do, what we would like to do in the next 30-40 minutes is just to give you a brief overview of the project that we did that started in 2009 as a research on the transformation of the place and space of theater, to put it in a very broad sense, and that incorporates or includes film in all parts of the project. It includes film, performance, and discourse. So what is shown here in the walk-in cinema is only the film part, so to say. We did 6 case studies on the transformation of the space and place in theater in 6 different cities over the course of the past 5 years, and we just finished the last one, which is Beirut, which is in the numbering number 5, not number 6, but for funding reasons we had to wait until we were able to do the Beirut film. So now, for the first time also for us, we had the overview over all those 6 case studies, and from the very beginning it was the idea to open up this discussion on the urban meeting place into a more international discussion. So that's why we went to different locations with very different cultural background, very different urban conditions, which is Lagos in Nigeria, Tehran in Iran, Berlin, and then Detroit in the US, Beirut in Lebanon, obviously, and Mönchengladbach, which is this unpronounceable city very close to Düsseldorf and Cologne in the west of Germany. But besides these 6 films that we did, all of the case studies included long-term research. We tried to meet with sociologists, architects, with performers in each city. We worked with performers. And also we did a number of performative events. And one of them happened last year in December in Lagos, in Nigeria. So after 5 years we went back to the same city and made another step after the completion of the film that we did in 2010 there. And actually, as a start, we just wanted to show you a short excerpt of a series of conversations that we did in an empty open space there. It's a former federal government press building, which is a derelict building since a number of years. And the Goethe Institute and Ford Foundation are planning to develop this into a new art space. And we did an event there in December that is partly documented actually in the entrance hall of the South Gallery. And for this event we tried to bring theoreticians, artists, performers together and ask them to get into a conversation about the question of the space and place of theater in Nigeria. And we chose this because we think, in general, what we would like to engage you is to discuss how, in what way our research relates to some maybe more recent or contemporary questions here in Turkey and Istanbul. Because for us, when we came here I was here for the past 3 weeks and last year as well, there were some obvious links, but maybe this is something we can discuss later. So for now, we just will show you this little excerpt and then consider.
We were at the occupying Nigeria protests at Ojota a couple of months ago. You will see a plethora of art performances from different groups coming from different parts of Lagos. We didn't mind whether there was any so-called stage or not. As a matter of fact, when the only stage had been taken over by the musicians, they were able to create pockets. Once there are people to watch, there is a performance space. And that's
this whole issue of theater, it's like the subjects and the objects with architecture and theater, they change. Like 1 minute you can be in an enclosed space in the sense of an amphitheater or something, and then the next minute you're actually outside taking on, and theater is performed around you. So there's so many variations about this. What I was trying to draw on from what you were saying, was that the actual iconography of this whole thing, it changes. And when we were talking about this project, it seemed to me that they were at a crossroads with the thinking about theatre. So an effect that was it an object that was constructed and built with its own rules and its own guidelines, and these people come and parachute into this environment and use it as such? Or is it about the whole myth, the whole mythology surrounding space, that how do we create space? How do what informs us to make space? We're not building a theatre, but we are making.
I've run a theatre in my head for years.
Yeah. So would you build a physical theatre?
The physical theatre, I have the resources.
Would you?
For what I know, it doesn't have to be huge resources. If I live in a community, I mean, community theatre is perhaps what.
If you built it, how would it be any different from the national
It's
theatre?
my theatre, it's not a national theatre.
Yeah.
It must be a national theatre. If you and I must build a theatre, that means both of us must sit down and agree. So a bit of us, a bit of each of us must go into it. It's not build a theatre, you can build one yours. It's your taste. You know what you want to use it to achieve. But if it must serve the interest of you and I, that means that it must be a consensus. It must be a consensus building. So you can't just sit down somewhere in one office and say, you want to impose or legislate a national theatre.
Would you see theatre as an object, as an entity, or would you see it basically as a thought, as in your mind?
It's thought given life. If it's not fully considered, it's not much like that.
Okay, but how do we then run our traditional theatre? All those masqueraders and different people that define different spaces as they go, and when they are gone, the space is clear, and then when they come back again, the space is alive again. That is theatre. How did we manage that space then? There was no buildings. There was no architecture to articulate the space or anything, but things were just done randomly. So how did we manage to do that? Because it was still theatre.
The society then agreed on the paradigms of performances. And they knew that the moment the masquerade leaves this place, it becomes a market.
And so how do you evoke that kind of thing? How do you capture it?
In modern times, we don't necessarily have to go back to.
Okay, there are two things in this excerpt. You saw Ropo Evenla. This is the man with the scarf. It's an actor and director from Lagos, Nigeria, and Momo Desano. He's an architect in Lagos, and this is actually it's an excerpt from our favorite conversation from the 9 we did. We tried always to combine an artist as practitioner and a thinker, and it was very exciting for us to experience that the talk about the space of theatre is like in a faraway culture like Nigeria. You can also do it, and Nigeria, they don't have this specialized theatre architecture like we know it from Germany, and you can talk about the same issues, and you're actually discussing the same problems. Even the culture is so different. If we discuss the issue of theatre, we have to make clear first, theatre means the content, and theatre means the space. And the school projects, our project, State Theatre, is never talking about content, is never about the subject. As Momo said, theater is the subject and it's the object. So we are always talking about the objects, we are always talking about the space of theater. This whole project just talks about the space of theater and it never talks about what you see or experience on stage. So what I also like, in the very end there was a little sentence about Robo said, if the masquerade leaves the market, it becomes a market again. And this is like also something in theater history, what you have about, I think in all early theaters, you have this phenomenon, theater was happening on marketplaces and it never has theater architecture. There was no specialized theater architecture. Theater was happening outside on the market, and so what he's referring to as happening today, also in the Occupy Nigeria movement, was theater was just happening. The people, the crowd itself, were creating the space. So there's also some universal connection, a very simple one, if you want to see it like this. But we were, I will talk a little bit about some issues from our first trilogy of films. We have done it, as you see, between 2009 and it's the second one actually, 2009 and 2011. We worked about theaters in Lagos, Tehran, and Berlin, and so the question, we choose 3 houses which were national or state theaters, and the common thing in between these 3 houses in Lagos, Tehran, and Berlin were that these theaters were empty, they were not in use, temporary not in use, and we were interested mainly in the question what happens if an art form like theater needs a specialized architecture. So we have 3 different samples of theater architecture from the 19th century to the 20th century, and what happens actually if a state government decides that the art form theater that she wants to use the art form theater for its national representation. So what happens if the theater architecture has also not only to present cultural events, but also a national, has to carry a national identification. So the basic question we had in the pop-up theater, which was also part of this conversation, was in Nigeria back then, is the National Theatre of Nigeria, is that a building or is that an idea? And this sentence is also covering a lot of our research in the past years. When people in Germany think of theater as a building type, they mostly think of a very classical architecture, and this classical theater architecture is a very complicated one. It consists of 2 buildings. It's a functional building and it's a public building. The functional building is the stage and all the grey technical rooms, spaces you have, and the public part of the building is, of course, it's the space for the audience and all spaces for representation in front, and also like the front of a building is highly defined by representation. And so our third film of the first trilogy was about the State Opera in Berlin, and this is a very, very classical example of a German opera house. What I described, a divided building which consists of 2 buildings, a functional one and a public one. And then we have 2 other examples in our series. The second one was a building type of theater which came up in the 50s. It was a phenomenon after the Second World War that the architects didn't wanted to. They wanted to make something new. They actually wanted to build a theater for a new audience, and this audience should be like everybody. It should be the citizens. I mean, in East Germany, it should be more the workers' society, what was defined like that or propagated like that, and in West Germany, maybe more a kind of citizen bourgeoisie society. And our example of the trilogy is the theater building in Mönchengladbach, which was completed in the end of the 50s. And you can clearly see the facade has a very, very different idea to the classical theater. As example, as the state opera, it looks more like a warehouse. We have a glass facade which defines that the audience inside and the citizen outside are actually closer to each other. They are not. You are not going inside the theater, going into a complete illusion. You are not divided from the city. Being in the theater means you are still inside the city. The second very important part was the public space in front of the theater. Then this picture shows like the theater which doesn't exist anymore. It was demolished in 2012. It was empty for 10 or 15 years. And lastly, this in the 50s newly invented glass facade was just used as a backdrop for a market. So the theater was a long time not in use anymore. Then there was another idea, more coming up in the 60s and 70s, to don't make such a specialized building which is just dedicated to theater. There were coming up buildings, multi-purpose buildings, which were dedicated to theater, to culture, to sports, and also to do congresses, for instance. But I mean, these two last building types represent maybe a more democratic idea of theater architecture, so to say. The architects believe that the idea of theater shouldn't be so bourgeois or aristocratic. It should be something for multi-purpose or for everybody. So you can call it also the palace for the people. But this is just one aspect. I just want to make a few notes about theater as national representation of culture and national identity. As I said, the theater in Mönchengladbach was built in the end of the 50s. In the end of the 50s in Germany, it was a gesture to build a theater after the Second World War and to do a new definition. And our other example, the National Theatre of Nigeria in Lagos, was also a highly political gesture because it was built a few years after the Biafran War, the civil war in Nigeria, and it was built on purpose because Nigeria was hosting the second Pan-African Festival Festag in 1975, and for this event, so the National Theatre of Nigeria is actually an event architecture. They built the theatre in Lagos. And then the next aspect, you don't see the theatre in Lagos, you see the Palace of Sports and Culture in Varna, because the government in Nigeria actually formed a little they sent a few experts around the world, and they found finally a building in Bulgaria, in Varna, what would match their expectations for the National Theatre in Nigeria. So the Bulgarian firm Techno Exports Roy became. They said, please build us this theater in Varna, but blow it up, make it 3 times bigger, and give it more functions. And so Techno Exports Roy managed to do it in a very short time. The climate in Nigeria is very different, but that for the venue, for the event Festag, it didn't matter because Nigeria was an upcoming oil country and had too much money to spend. And so they built it, they borrowed socialist Bulgarian architecture to form the symbol for the new and unified Nigeria in 1975. And here are just coming a few pictures. You saw the national symbol. This is a very dark picture. It's the VIP entrance, and also what's interesting about this, it's like a whole ideologic picture program. Like this whip entrance is representing the Nigerian culture in this wooden reliefs. And here you just see spaces where, when you remember the picture before from Varna, the architecture is it's very identical. It's just bigger. And here you see a view inside the big hall. The big hall is a hall with a so-called 5,000 seater with a removable stage, which was in 1975 a technical, very complicated thing, and also it was just functioning in Nigeria, and in Varna it's still functioning. In Nigeria it was just functioning for 10-12 years. Then the whole architecture became problems with cooling, also the money went down, and the revolving stage wasn't working anymore, and then there was also a fire, and after this fire accident the hall was never used anymore. The theater is not completely dead. The side halls from the theater are still in use, but for other purposes. So the cinemas were turned into theater halls, the exhibition spaces got turned into cinema, the cinemas were turned into theater halls, and the exhibition space was turned into cinema halls, and the conference halls were turned into rent-out spaces for weddings. But all these things are, like, actually this building is, nobody is allowed to go in, actually. It's highly under security guarded. So this, the next example, our second film we did in the Baghdad Hall in Tehran, and you see this. It's not a very good picture, but it's hard to capture this building from outside because the other street is so narrow. You actually see a Congress Center-like architecture from the 60s from outside, and representational spaces like on the ground level, but inside there is actually a theater which is kind of copied from the Mailänder Scala, so a classical European theater. So this the whole theater is actually a building consisting of 2 different architectures, and the architect made it a little bit more Iranian, was using this. You see this ornament. It's coming from. It's like the old Persian ornament.
Persepolis.
From Persepolis, so the big reference is Persepolis, of course. Just want to put my finger on a few problems which such specialized theater architectures have, and because of these problems, a lot of theater buildings worldwide are not in use anymore. Because these buildings are technically very, very specialized, and if one thing is not working and there is no money to maintain it, those buildings often are completely out of use. If just one technical thing, like a Lego, is not working anymore, the whole house is like after a while falling apart. So actually, just the government as a sponsor mainly can maintain such a complicated and expensive building, mostly. And the other thing I want to point on is the very fixed relation between performer and viewer. As I said before, the classical theater building has two parts. So the performer is on one part and the viewers in the other, the public part. And a classical theater building defines very highly not only where is the performer and where is the viewer, it also defines which sort of viewer is sitting where. And also the Iranian example in Tehran defines, it was built by the Shah in the 1960s, so he copied a kind of aristocratic order into Iran, which it was not fitting, so we also copied the idea to have like a loge, a central loge where so the king was sitting, or so the Shah was sitting. And that is actually, just as last thing, I want to show, can you move further? This in the, coming back to the State Opera in Berlin, it's also an interesting example of this fixed definition of viewer. You see this loge, which is a central loge in Tehran. You see this loge actually on the side of the stage, inside of the proscenium frame on stage. And this is actually the space for the emperor, the king. It was also the place of Erich Honecker, and nowadays it's a place of Daniel. And the interesting thing is that the viewer here is always part of the spectacle. He actually can just see 1/3 of the stage because of the angle, but he is seen by everybody. So it's just another possibility. In the State Opera, you don't have this central loge, which is like the best seat and the best view, whatever. And another interesting thing is also this golden relief, which nobody sees except the one which is in the loge. And this was done in the 50s, and it shows a parade by socialist workers in front of the State Opera in Berlin. And it's an interesting detail how the socialist era was kind of continuing traditions of an architecture, which, I mean, they kind of adapted this, the loge thing, and also the style. So they, in the 50s, they were actually building a kind of neo-Baroque style, which was not happening in East Berlin in those years. So these are just some brief notes about things we are discussing in our films. There's one big exception, or maybe yes, we can see some more pictures and details from the State Opera. The pictures are showing that the inside of the architecture, because the State Opera was rebuilt so many times, like there were like 4 or 5 big redefinitions of the inside and the outside. So the inner architecture is not matching the outer architecture anymore. The whole inside of the architecture was becoming a set design in itself. So you see it very clearly on this window. There's a missing of 0.5 meter from the inside window to the outside window. And there are many more details in the architecture itself. We had the chance for our film to document the coming down of the reconstruction when they started to reconstruct the State Opera, which is not ready nowadays in 2010, between 2010 and 2011. And the next picture shows that they put the inner architecture in a depot outside from Berlin, and it was amazing that you could still step inside this architecture being in a depot, because it's a very, very specific architecture. One last note: the exception in our films is the film about Beirut. Daniel will talk more about it. The Beirut doesn't have a national theater, doesn't have a state theater, and we chose this place for a case study because of this. We were interested in why Beirut doesn't have a national theater or a state theater. Why isn't it possible to have it there? So we were actually portraying the central square, which is Marty Square in Beirut, and just claiming it and asking other people if they can think of this square as national theater for Lebanon. So that's...
Okay, so just maybe to briefly sum it up, the first trilogy, Lagos, Tehran, and Berlin, is asking the question: what happens to a built theater structure when, besides being a theater, it needs to fulfill national symbolic function, like maybe the AKM also for some time had to do. And we chose these three cities, or these three theater examples, because all of them are in the state of transformation. What Constanze didn't mention is, of course, that the opera house in Tehran we chose because in '79, after the Islamic Revolution, it was no longer used as an opera house, since the Islamic Republic of Iran doesn't support the bourgeois art form of ballet and opera anymore, and the Berlin opera house is now currently still under transformation. So, if we would, we never did, but if we would want to draw a conclusion from this first trilogy, is that this built structure, empty, is not flexible enough for ever-changing social need for meeting place in the urban fabric. So, in the second trilogy, Detroit, Beirut, Mönchengladbach, we wanted to go a step further and see what kind of meeting places would be there instead. So the three theaters in Lagos, Tehran, and Berlin could potentially be used as theater again in the future. And our research in Detroit, Beirut, and Mönchengladbach started also with like big representational theater buildings, but that definitely will never be used again as theaters. So in Detroit, we started our research in the very beginning with the Michigan Theater that some of you might know, thanks to the art photographs by Stan Douglas, which this is one of them. This theater was one of the big movie and vaudeville theaters in the 1930s, when Detroit was one of the biggest, actually after the New York Broadway, the second biggest theater city in North America. So they had about 35,000 theater seats to fill every night, only at the main square in Detroit, Detroit downtown. But as some of you might know, Detroit had a very downfall since the 50s, when they had 2 million inhabitants due to the decline of the auto industry. They lost 2/3 of their population, and so most of the theaters had to close for various reasons. And the Michigan Theater in the 1970s, after serving as a rock concert hall and a porn cinema for some time, turned finally into a parking garage. So theater and the question of cars and traffic is maybe another thing that could also be linked to some spaces around here, in Beirut and Taksim, of course. And the only reason why this theater, which you can see here, stayed is this, which is an office building. It was built connected with the office building, and for static reasons you could not demolish the theater because the office building would fall over. So that's why the landlords decided to make it a parking garage. garage for the tenants of the office building. In Beirut, we started our research with two different buildings. So when in Detroit, the reason for the fact that a lot of theaters will never be used again as theaters was the economic development and the demographic development of the city. In Beirut, besides it being not a core theatrical culture, of course the Civil War destroyed a lot of the infrastructure that will never be rebuilt. This actually is modern. It used to be modernist architecture, cinema as part of a big business center called the Egg or the Dome, that actually just became a symbol for the post-Civil War era for some people after in the state that you see it there as a ruin, because some people started to do rave parties in their exhibitions, even theater shows. So there is a huge movement against the demolition of this building, although in its original life as a cinema it was not of a huge importance. But there is this fight between developers that want, of course, to tear it down, to build something new in the city center, and the people who want to save it for cultural use. It's another picture of it. And the other building we were briefly looking at the beginning of our research in Beirut is the Grand Théâtre, which represents the French cultural input into the city, which also was completely destroyed during the Civil War, and now remains a ruin, very close actually to the other building downtown. And the third theater that will never be used as a theater is the already mentioned Stadttheater City Theater in Mönchengladbach, which used to look like this. Constanze talked about it. Then, before the demolition was just used as a big Christmas present. And during the 80s, they already added some smaller shopping malls. So that was the first step of it, converting it into a shopping place. These are some images from the inside, where you can see the modernist relation to the architecture, to being the design of the lamps. And this will never be a theater again, as maybe some of you have seen before we started the talk, the end of the Mönchengladbach film, for the simple reason that it was demolished completely. And we, in our film, documented the process that took 1.5 years from its empty state to when it was completely gone. So, but this was just the beginning of the research in the 3 cities, because we started with this structure that's never going to be used as a theater anymore, and then we thought, okay, from that point on, where else could theater move, or what could it mean, theater, if we don't have this big national symbolic architecture anymore, or if we don't want it maybe because it's not flexible enough, or it cannot react to economic, political, religious changes, or just social, the change of social interest. In Detroit, Detroit is an interesting case in a way, also compared to Istanbul, because what does this whole question about public versus private space mean in a city like Istanbul compared to a city like Detroit? Because Detroit is a shrinking city. So, but a city is a very simple thing we always say, is a city grows like this, but it doesn't shrink like this. So it stays in the same scale. The whole city infrastructure is developed for 2 million people with wide boulevards and everything, but the city gets holes. A lot of privately owned space now in the past 2-3 decades in Detroit became public space because people just left. So that is an opposite development to a lot of things that we witness here in Europe and maybe also in Istanbul, where a lot of public space becomes privatized. So that for us is a very interesting case to compare. What does it mean, this whole discussion about private public space and meeting places in the city? So, for example, and we went into the neighborhoods in Detroit and found places like this where people, this is a former private house that is turned into, they just removed the sides and put some benches, and so the neighborhood people can meet and have like neighborhood discussions, little, I don't know, hip-hop or even cooking performances. This is another example that we found and we discussed, which is a neighborhood garage where people also meet for events. They're not putting the cars, so it's actually the counterpart for the Michigan Theater, where the big theater became a parking garage. Here, the little parking garage becomes a neighborhood meeting space. And for those who have seen the film, what we then did, we brought people from these neighborhood places back to the Michigan Theater, but not using the Michigan Theater as a theater, like a big theater, but as a small venue for roundtable discussion in the film to exchange about these ideas of how to use the space that is exorbitant in the city of Detroit. Then in Beirut, after we thought, okay, we have to look at the public space, how people are actually using it. And the thing in Beirut is that there is actually no. I talked to Robert Saliba, architect from Beirut, and he said, when I asked him about the public space, he said it doesn't exist in Beirut because of the simple reason, because public space needs citizenship as a condition, and this does not exist in a country like Lebanon, where all sorts of social, religious groups, political interests, and also the family clans, they have this different interest that they cannot find a common space to share these different interests. And so you have interesting in the city center of Beirut, you have the vicinity of opposing qualities of urban space. You have reconstruction areas where, in a historicist way, the ruins of the Civil War were reconstructed, like in this area, but you see it is actually gated because it's a highly security area. It's most of the shops there are empty, so it cannot really be used by everyone. Also, it was reconstructed, that is necessary to add, by a private company, Solidaire, that was founded and directed for long by Rafi Hariri, the former president who was assassinated in 2005. And he assigned this company, a private company, as a worldwide unique case to reconstruct the whole city center, to put it in the hands of one company. We discussed it the other day that there are some links maybe to Toki here in Istanbul, between Solidaire and Toki here. Yeah, and just around the corner you have spaces like this, which is an area which used to be controlled by the Amal and the Hezbollah. Very close, it's just 200 meters from the space you saw before. And now most of those buildings are also torn down, and it will be turned into the Beirut Digital District. So these are spaces that also, when you walk around here, or even the fact of the vicinity of these very different kind of public spaces, remind me of the area here. I mean, when you go from Istiklal to Talabashi, and you see how it looks there. I mean, this photo could have been taken in Talabashi. So, as already Constanze said, what we said, okay, the least defined space in all of this vicinity of opposing urban structures in Beirut is this market square, which used to be the French colonial central square of Beirut. And since the Civil War, for various reasons, looks like this, it's just gravel, and on the left side there is also parking. So it's not yet developed, and it remains this open wound for the city, which might have the potential for a national meeting space, but well, the Society of Women seems to be pretty far from that moment. But so that's why in our film, the Martyr Square, the film, which is a 65-minute uncut walk from this Amal controlled region to a view of the seaside, crossing Martyr Square. So that's why we replaced the architectural structure with an open space, open square as a meeting place. And the last one is, this is the plot where it used to be the Mönchengladbach City Theatre. So that's another open space that we wanted to highlight and emphasize as a moment in the transformation of cities between the demolishing or the loss of importance of the built structure and the new structure that will come. So it's a wasteland. It was a wasteland for 2-3 weeks. Now in June 2014 there is already a shopping mall there. So the theatre was replaced by a shopping mall. Maybe another link to interests and developments close by here. And we said, okay, this empty plot, this wasteland will be built on. This is already decided, we cannot do anything against it, but what we can do is we can bring people together from Mönchengladbach to discuss this issue, the interest in space and the interest in how to meet in a city and how to do something that we allegorically could still call theatre in this empty plot, in this wasteland for a day. And so they built, maybe if you've seen the end of the Mönchengladbach film, they built for one day this little improvised theatre out of pallets as a temporary meeting space in winter to discuss. So one important aspect for us in the second trilogy was no longer to talk about theatre in itself, but to make the discussion, the discourse on the meeting space and the urban fabric, the theatre itself. That's why we staged this roundtable discussion in Detroit. That's why we asked in Beirut people to give us audio tours through the city center, which appear in the film. And that's why we staged this symposium, one-day symposium and an improvised theatre in the empty plot in Mönchengladbach.
I just have some quick notes about the actors or protagonists of our films, because we were just mainly talking about architecture. So in the first 3 films, we decided to work always with one performer, choreographer from the city. So in Lagos it was Shegun Adefila. He's a choreographer. He's a director of Crown Troupe, is a dance group from the slum Bariga, and he's also a Nollywood actor. And we staged. We worked on a scene with him together. We staged the scene outside on the street. It's here in this case. It's in front of his. It's called Bariga Art Center. It was before the house of his mother, and he invented this Bariga Art Center. He formed it when he was actually thrown out from National Theatre, where he had a contract for a year to perform the National Theatre. Then there was a change in direction, so we lost this possibility to perform there, and then he formed this art center. In the second trilogy, the second film in Tehran, we worked with Sarah Rehani. She's also a choreographer from Tehran, and the place for her staged performance in front of the camera was also always a still camera, so the frame of the camera can be seen as proscenium of the stage. So this space was the rooftop of her parents' house, because rooftops in Tehran are one of the rare public spaces we found in the city, and as probably everybody knows, they have a special meaning in the revolution in 1979 and also in the Green Movement. And in the third film, Berlin, it's Hermann Heisig, choreographer from Berlin. He was performing in front of the construction site State Opera And the special thing was that we shot the scene as if it would be inside. So, but it's still outside. You also see like cars passing. And then for the second trilogy, Daniel was actually talking about it. We choose to always ask a group of people representing the city. We asked always artists, architects, economists, historians, just to give their perspective on the development of theater, of performativity in open space. So this was the stage discussion in the Michigan Theater. Here on the next picture you see the group of Beirutis which came together for our walk in the film itself. You don't see them, you just hear them giving us or the camera single after each other a tour through the area. And in the third case it was the already mentioned space for free space for 3 weeks after the demolition of the theater, and the little stage with pallets was also built and invented on purpose for that. And the scene shows that these people, citizens from Mönchengladbach, are actually building this stage together before they do their symposium. So now we are ready.
If there are any questions, we'll pass the...
Further questions, we'll pass the microphone. So any comments or questions? Please direct to the speakers.
Okay. This will be in Turkish, so I will translate it.
Okay.
No, I can translate it here. So.
Yeah.
This will be in Turkish, so I will translate it.
Sure.
Çok etkilendim. Tam net olarak tabii her şeyi anlamış değilim ama ben ekibi Ankara'ya da gitmelerini istiyorum.
She would like you to go to Ankara.
Yani hep İstanbul, lütfen Ankara'ya gitsinler.
Okay.
Ankara'yı araştırsınlar, kalenin etrafını, eski Ankara'yı çeksinler. Orada da opera binası var. Yani Ankara'da bu çalışmalarına devam etsinler, dilerim. Ankara'da da çünkü aynı bedbaht durumlar var. Aynı yıkılmış yerler var. Yani 2 ağaç kalmış, o kadar.
Could you maybe give some examples for the parallels?
Örnekler. Tabii Ankara'da işte kalenin etrafı, o Çankırı Caddesi, Roma hamamları, tarihi yerler var. Agust heykeli. Bayağı geniş bir alan orası. Ulus
in general where we have the other songs.
Terk edilmiş devlet tiyatrosu yok ama etrafında terk edilmiş yerler var. Bu tiyatroyu belki spesifik şey yaptılar ama yani o opera da fazla bir şey değil yani. Aktif değil. Ama ondan sonra onun etrafı çok kötü. Yani oraya ulaşan yerler, etraf yani birebir opera binasıyla ilişkili olmayabilir ama yani yıkılmışlık ve terk edilmişlik orada bir şeylik var. Ankara'da da var yani. Ankara'yı da araştırsınlar bence. Bina olarak tabii opera binası anlatıldı herhalde burada anladığım kadarıyla. Özellikle yıkılmış, orayı almışlar, insanlar gitmişler. Tabii devlet tiyatroları ama yani devlet tiyatrolarının etrafında da kötü şeyler gelişiyor. Yani Ankara'nın evet devlet tiyatrosu gayet duruyor ama. Tabii yani ben bu ekibin gidip Ankara'ya bir şöyle gezmesini rica ederim ama direkt tabii opera binamız duruyor. Evet orada hiç problem yok ama etrafta böyle üzüntü yaratan yerler var. Yani daha başka bir konu olarak etraf önemli yerler olarak ele alırlarsa başka bir opera binası dışında bir olay geliştirirlerse çok güzel çünkü resmetmişler, tespit etmişler. Yani belki orada böyle bir oluşum yok ama insanlar alma töreni falan filan
Yani tamam, ben konuyu hakikaten opera üzerinden devam etmek istediğim için
Anlıyorum.
Etmiş olduk. Şimdi mikrofonu...
Tamam, anladım. Teşekkürler.
Başka, is there any other questions related to the opera, maybe any comments related to AKM? Because we thought it was important that when we were here, so ben bir şey söyleyeyim.
One thing that had, as we had gone through this this stage of AKM as is now, as this inaccessible space, one particular moment was when the first draft by the architects for renovation was out. They were considering what you had already suggested as the inflexibility of these buildings to cope with what's going on in real life today. So they had already suggested certain other, let's call it private activities like cafes and restaurants. I mean, small, guessable suggestions. But this was met with quite a strong resistance that the opera was supposed to stay only as the opera. And it's maybe more complicated than this because there are many different groups inside AKM. It's not just the opera, but there's also the theater. These are all different entities in managerial positions. But I was wondering, since you had so much experience, is conservatism part of this performance arts? I don't know how to put it correctly, but the resistance in other places, or this question of inflexibility, in your opinion, in your conversations with other people, how is it met? This, for instance, the resistance here changed the plans, which was, it's good to go through a negotiation, but I wonder how it is discussed in other contexts.
Yeah, we decided to do case studies, which means that we really wanted to find the specific local conditions for the situation in each city. But of course, still you can compare. And I don't know, I don't want to make a general comment about conservatism or something. But of course, in the moment where a specific built structure is met with a symbolic meaning, either it's representing a certain regime or a certain state, or it's representing, it's this mixture of stage representation and cultural use. So people that are interested in culture and that want to fight for spaces where culture can be produced and reproduced, they are always torn. And we could, in the case with the National Theatre of Nigeria, this is very obvious. You can see the art scene. A couple of years ago, there were the plans to privatize it and make it something else, and the art scene got together and they actually managed to keep it in the state of agony that it is now, which also doesn't help anyone. So that's always, and also then there's this group of people who now start to really appreciate, with good reasons, this kind of modernist architecture, which the National Theatre of Nigeria represents, and the AKM also represents. So why are we tearing down this architectural heritage? So there are a lot of, I think, in this whole discussion, there are a lot of aspects that are met and that create different kind of alliances, pro and contra, removing, restoring, making different use of it. But the problematic, as I said, is always when the state representational aspect meets the cultural aspect. So that gets, in the end, into the core question of what kind of culture you want as a society. Do you want this kind of culture that is defined by this kind of architecture and this kind of spaces, or not?
I would also say that another example is the Palace of the Republic in Berlin, East Berlin, had a kind of similar architecture, like an architecture from the same time, or with a similar idea, like in Lagos, maybe like the AKM. And I think that the time when this architecture was created, that had certain ideas, that this house is for everybody. It's a Kulturhaus, it's a house for everybody. And if you hear the artist in Lagos, and I mean the theater in Lagos was for more than 20 years not in use, and they were still thinking, this house is for us, this is our house. In fact, it was the only state-subsidized cultural building in the whole country. So that's why they were going on the street and demonstrating. And I remember very well the whole year-long discussions for the Palast der Republik, the Palace of Republic in East Berlin, which is demolished for a few years by now. But there was a same thinking. The architecture was, even it was an architecture from the socialist time in East Berlin, the architecture in my thinking carried this idea, this house is for everybody, this is the house of the people. And people react to that. The idea is still alive. And from what I heard, that happened here too, Judy again.
I mean, as I said, it's always the schizophrenia of we're fighting for preserving the existing structures that actually don't meet our needs. Just because we know when we don't fight for them and they just remove them, they will not replace it with something else that suits our needs better. But that's a schizophrenia, of course, and I don't have my own opinion. I don't know what's better. But that's also reflected in this discussion in the Mönchengladbach film, because of course it's sad that this modernist architecture is gone, because it is replaced by a shopping mall, but on the other hand, it was no longer the place for the city for meeting. Yeah.
Well, I have a little the impression that you monocausal only on the architecture, and I think you must also discuss the repertoire, at least in the and the quality of the theatre. And you have many German theatres which has similar architecture than that in Mönchengladbach, for example, who work very well simply because the theatre is good. And you have other stages where the repertoire and maybe the director is not good, and those do not work, although they have different architectures. I think this is a little a problem, because you also show very different places, of course, but very manifold traditions, and I think it's probably was an idea of post-colonial thinking to represent always cities in the same way as European cities stage their own urban environment, and therefore I think there are other factors which have to be considered to discuss these things. I mean, what I would like to be interested in is the discussion here in Istanbul. 2 days ago I was in Beirut, where they put a new opera house, which is really impressive. If you see the inside, the new stage, the moving stage. Will this work? What is your opinion? I mean, I'm asking the Istanbul people here. Yes, they know what it is.
Okay, I haven't seen that one.
It's very new. It started. They have in the opera festival. They have one performance. They told me, and 700 seats and very new technique. It was 700 seats and very impressive as a building actually. But found it interesting that not the center has been chosen again, and that has been used to some of the bigger, newer suburbs.
Bakırköy'deki için bir şey söyleyebilirim. Özür dilerim, Türkçe söyleyeceğim. Bakırköy'dekini devlet operası kullanacak.
The one in Bakırköy will be used by the state opera, görüşürüz.
Çok ihtiyacımız var. Şu anda bir tane bina kullanıyoruz. Süreyya Operası'nı kullanıyoruz ve opera için komik derecede
Siz
küçük.
opera sanatçısınız.
Hayır, tiyatro ama
She's from the theater, and we only. I know this one that we only have Süreyya operası in Kadıköy, and this is something that was needed, so it will operate. Dolayısıyla işleyecek zaten herhalde.
devlet operası açık kalırsa önümüzdeki sezon orayı
If the opera is still here with us, if the state opera is still in action, it will be used properly. That's what we think.
Yeah, but maybe I can say just one thing to the monocausality. I mean, there's always a lot of other factors, but of course to highlight something or to emphasize something, you have to start at some point. And we deliberately, that's what Constanze said in the beginning, we deliberately decided not to look at what is presented on stage, not to look at the institutionalized structure, but really to start from the location. Because in that sense, it makes sense to have this global, local series of case studies. Because if we look at the repertoire, even the concept of repertoire is a very German one. You don't find that in Nigeria. You don't find it in the USA, even in the way we have it in Germany. So of course they're good and bad directors, and they're directors that are able to fill conventional classical theater architecture perfectly, and everyone can have a nice evening. But that's not our topic. Our topic is the question: how can we relate the space and place of theater in the urban fabric to an ever-changing political and social situation? With the example of state representation of architecture, but also with the example of other meeting places in the cities.
Any other comments or questions you could ask also directly? I don't have to read for you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No more questions.
Push.
There is one.
It's not a question.
Bir saniye beklersen
It's not exactly a question, like, I don't know, in between comment and question. I just want to address like the part of this ephemerality or I don't know, flexibility of a building, like the concrete material of the building and the transformation of the culture. Like recently, the use of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, like whether to keep it as a museum or I don't know, mosque, or whether change it in accordance with the religion that this building belongs to. I just read a lot of articles about the religious buildings that are being transformed with different functions. Like there are many buildings that I know of in Austria that are being used not as churches now, like because they said we have only 2 requests for weddings, or we have really little number of people who come here to pray, so they just want to use these buildings really more efficiently. Or there are many buildings that are being like used with different functions in Sweden as well. Like we can have more examples. So in regard to this symbolic meaning of a building, like you mentioned before, because like religion is one of the biggest symbolism that is being used in architecture. Maybe like to look at the different examples of these buildings, religious buildings in Europe and also in other geographies of the world, like how do they cope up with these buildings that are not being occupied very efficiently or like commonly? Because I heard that, for instance, in Sweden, one of the buildings is being used now as theater for children. So there is like transformation of a religious building into theater there. So it's again a transformation because, like as you said, it's a must. So we need to transform or create some spaces ephemeral enough, or I don't know, transformable enough to cope up with these changes that we live in our lives. So, like as I said, it's not a question, but maybe in the part that you want to like look for this concreteness of the buildings and the transformability of the functions in itself, the religious buildings can, I don't know, suggest you some different perspectives or examples, or maybe you already know of some interesting examples.
I mean, the case of Nigeria is very interesting in that sense because, I mean, the church plays a huge role in that society there, and they occupied all sorts of spaces and turned them into churches. And even, who said that when we entered this empty printing press building where we then put up the pop-up theater last December, someone told us, oh, you're Shagun, the choreographer. Yeah, you're very lucky that that you got that space for art, because usually the church was not faster this time, maybe, because when there's an empty space in Vegas, the church comes in and makes a church out of it. And there's another comment that just comes to my mind. A couple of years ago, when we had just started this series, I had a longer conversation with the Swiss architect Michael Guggenheim, who's an expert and wrote a lot of articles on the transformation architecture, and his idea was, he said, the only building type that you cannot transform into anything else is a church, is a cathedral. And at the end of our discussion, he agreed that actually it might be the cathedral and a state theater. So in the moment where an architecture has this additional symbolic value, then it's hard to transform it, and that's why so many people are demonstrating in front of the Hagia Sophia. If it was just concrete, no one would care.
And it's just a fun addition. Like, I remember a comment in one of the articles that I read, like, if the church or this religious building is not beautiful enough, you can make it a place for contemporary art. So weird material make it like interesting enough. But if it is like more historical, that you want to keep it as the way it is, make it a normal museum, not a space for a museum, not the, I don't know, space for contemporary art. Like, it was a really fun comment that people, like, it shows how people react to these buildings, that they can't change the built material, but the function in it.
What's the situation actually? Will there be a mosque at Taksim Square at some point? You know better than me.
In the actual plans for the preservation of Beyoğlu was drawn up in 2011, but it took 20 years, I think, to have that master plan, and that did not include a mosque. But then there's always partial changes, because now I'm really confused. It did not also include the barracks, what is trying to become the shopping center, but it had this little note which was very tricky, which had enabled all this action on the government side. It had this note that said all buildings that are, gone building, lost buildings, they could, if there is great value to it, they could be reconstructed, which is a funny note. It's not. Normally, such master plans do not have this note, and with this note, they had already around Beyoğlu, they had already suggested either mosques or more, let's say, religious graveyards to be, I don't know how to call it, it's kind of a reconstruction, I don't remember the word, to be replaced. Even if, for instance, some of them were in the garden of a high school, for instance. So with this note, it's possible to turn anything back from the dead. That was how it all was capable. But Taksim never had a mosque, so at this moment there's nothing legal that would allow it.
Yeah, because in connection to our series of case studies, it would be an interesting perspective to have now a park and a modernist cultural center, and both of them replaced by a shopping mall and a mosque. If that really will happen, we'll come back and film it.
This is the question since the 80s. At one moment it may become a reality, I don't know.
Thank you very much.